The bobcat didn't growl. It didn't bare its teeth. It simply turned its head and looked directly into the eyes of a baby. That was the moment everything inside the cabin changed. Passengers froze mid-sentence. A stewardess, halfway down the aisle, locked her knees to steady the drink cart. Someone inhaled too sharply. Someone else whispered a prayer. But the baby didn't cry. He didn't recoil. He just blinked and reached forward. And the bobcat let him, not in a flash of aggression or dominance, but in complete stillness. Its breathing slowed. Its golden eyes softened, and the tip of its tail curled slightly inward, like a question left unanswered. No one could make sense of what they were seeing. A wild bobcat, loose, in an airplane cabin, seated beside an infant with no barrier between them. No cage, no leash, no glass. Just a soft blanket, a shared space, and the hum of the engines overhead. Row 14. The baby sat in the window seat. The bobcat had claimed the middle, and time itself seemed to step aside and wait. It was too strange to interrupt, too fragile to explain. A few seats back, an older man clutched his armrest. Not out of fear, at least not anymore, but out of reverence, the kind that creeps in when you're watching something sacred. The bobcat's ears flicked once. Its coat, dense and golden gray, rippled with emotion. It was young, perhaps 2 years old at most, but carried a weight far beyond its age. A knowing stillness, a kind of trust that wild things aren't supposed to have. Not here. Not now. Not like this. The baby's mother sat across the aisle, her body angled slightly toward them. She didn't panic. She didn't speak. She simply watched, like a person who already knew how the rest of the world would react. And yet she remained calm. Not careless. Not indifferent. Just deeply familiar with what others were only now beginning to see. The bobcat exhaled. It didn't twitch or hiss when the plane shifted gently through turbulence. It didn't flinch at the overhead chime or the rattle of a loose tray. It stayed close, anchored, its body brushing the baby's leg with such quiet deliberateness that even the air between them seemed to pause. One of the flight crew approached slowly, each step measured, like walking across ice. She leaned toward the woman across the aisle. Her voice was too low to hear, but the woman answered with a single nod and a slip of paper, some kind of certificate, folded and tucked into her boarding pass. The crew member scanned it, backed away, and whispered something into her radio. There was no announcement, no commotion, just the weight of attention pressing inward as more passengers realized what was happening. It wasn't just that there was a bobcat on board. It was where the bobcat chose to be, and what it was choosing to do. It wasn't pacing the aisle, wasn't hiding beneath a seat, wasn't staring out the window as if longing for escape. It was here, right here, voluntarily resting its head beside a human child, as if the two had never been anything but connected. The baby shifted slightly. The bobcat followed, not with its body, but with its breath. Sinking, mirroring, protecting. It was then that someone finally reached for their phone, not to call for help, not to send a message, but to document what they feared might never happen again. Still, the cabin remained hushed, not because of fear, but because of something deeper, a quiet awe that made everything else feel smaller. The bobcat blinked again. Its whiskers trembled faintly. Its gaze flicked toward the window, where streaks of sunlight broke through the clouds below. Then it turned back to the baby, still watching, still calm. The infant let out a soft hum, a happy, weightless sound, the kind only children make when they feel completely safe. And the bobcat leaned in, not to smell, not to investigate, but to rest its cheek against the child's tiny arm, as if this was the only place it had ever belonged. No one dared to move too quickly, Even the stewardess who'd started with doubt now lingered at the end of the aisle. Hands clasped, eyes glassy. The man in the window seat behind them wiped his cheek. Not because he understood, but because he didn't know what else to do with the feeling building in his chest. For one surreal stretch of minutes, there were no politics, no headlines, no safety briefings or standard procedures. There was only this: a predator and a child, together, bound by something older than instinct. And everyone aboard just watched, because even in the air, some moments are grounded so deeply, they never truly land. The cabin lights dimmed as the clouds thickened outside, washing the fuselage in shades of silver and blue. But inside row 14, there was stillness. Still that baby. Still that Bobcat. Still that unshakable calm between them. But the story didn't begin here. It began far from this altitude. On the ground, under gray skies, in the silence of wet leaves. Long before the plane. Long before the baby ever reached for fur. There was the forest. It was early spring when they first found him. Not the baby, the Bobcat. Rain had come and gone all night. It clung to every pine needle and soaked the moss until the ground hissed beneath boot steps. A wildlife officer had been tracking reports of strange cries near the logging roads, short, rasping yowls, unlike anything local dogs would make. And then they found him, a mound of fur curled beneath the fallen frame of a rotting cedar. Breathing shallow, eyes open, but unfocused, flecks of blood at the edges of his ears, and one paw twisted slightly, an injury older than it looked. They thought he wouldn't last the ride, but he did. They wrapped him in a wool blanket that smelled of hay and diesel. His breathing slowed. He didn't fight, didn't hiss. He only stared, as though waiting to see if this was going to be another kind of ending. But it wasn't. He arrived at a small rehab center tucked behind a barn. Not government-run, not on any formal list. Just a place where animals went when they didn't have another one. The woman who ran it, Ella, didn't speak much. She didn't talk to the animals. She didn't name them right away. She let them tell her who they were first. This one didn't make a sound for days. Didn't eat unless the room was dark. Didn't sleep unless it was raining. But he stayed alive. There was something in him, some slow refusal to let go. He didn't growl when she stitched his shoulder. Didn't swat when she checked his paw. He just watched her, constantly, like he was measuring her movements, weighing her breath, recording her shape. At night, she left the barn door slightly ajar. Rain would sweep across the wood shavings, dampening the floor. And always, by morning, the Bobcat had shifted closer to the door. Never left, but always closer. 3 weeks passed. Then one day, without warning, he stood, walked to the edge of his enclosure. Saturday. Anne waited. Ella stood across the room, unsure if it was instinct or invitation. She stepped closer. The Bobcat didn't move. She knelt. Still no motion. Then slowly, impossibly, he lowered his head and leaned it against the wire between them. Just once. Just enough. That was the first time she thought he might stay. Not because he couldn't survive elsewhere, but because something tethered him. Not to the barn. Not to the walls. To the quiet. To her presence. To the simple promise of consistency. He was not a pet. Never acted like one. But he began following her movement with a calmness that didn't feel wild. When she watered the horses, he watched. When she moved hay bales, he stretched and blinked. When she brought her infant son to sit with her in the afternoons, he lay at the far end of the barn, eyes open, silent. That baby, barely a few months old, had no memory of fear, only the sound of rain on a tin roof, the smell of cedar shavings, the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of the Bobcat's breath across the room. There were no incidents. No outbursts. Only presence. The barn itself became a kind of cathedral, not to worship, but to witness. Soft hay underfoot, filtered sunlight through the cracks in the wood. Damp, cool mornings filled with low coos from pigeons in the rafters. Every motion meant something. A pail set down, a door creaking closed, the sound of child laughter echoing gently in the rafters. And the bobcat remained, always near, never too close, but never far enough to forget. By the time the child could crawl, the bobcat was already meeting his gaze directly. When the baby reached out from his blanket, the bobcat didn't flinch. He blinked once, slowly, and lay back down. That was the first gesture. Later, there would be more. The baby would roll a wooden spoon across the barn floor, and the bobcat would watch it pass. He would place a soft toy near the animal's paws. Never thrown, never loud, just placed. The bobcat never played, but he never walked away either. That was their rhythm. Stillness beside movement. Wild beside softness. Two beings with no reason to trust, except for the rain, the barn, the silence, and each other. No one taught them how to behave. No one forced affection. The bond grew in the spaces between sound, and somewhere between the smell of pine resin, the low hush of dawn mist, and the warmth of fur brushing against soft cotton, something permanent formed. Unseen, but unmistakable. It was during one of those quiet mornings, just after rain, just before breakfast, that the bobcat stepped across the barn floor and sat directly beside the baby. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to be seen, to be known. And from that day forward, the two were never far apart. In sleep, the bobcat guarded the barn door. In light, he traced the child's steps with silent eyes. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't protection in the human sense. It was something else. A recognition of life, of presence, of being. And that was long before either of them boarded a plane. The bobcat never rushed. Even as the child began to walk, awkward and wobbly, fists clenched for balance, the animal never moved quickly. He waited. Every time the child rose to explore, the bobcat's ears would twitch. He would shift his body slightly, keeping the boy within a narrow triangle of vision. He didn't follow. He didn't lead. He observed. And whenever the child fell, which he often did, the bobcat would pause, watch, wait. Only when the boy sat still for a moment too long would the animal rise and walk slowly toward him, his steps soundless on the old barn floor. He'd stop just beside the child's knee, lower himself, and remain there. That was their unspoken agreement. The child was allowed to move, as long as he remembered that he was never truly alone. Rain became their constant companion. It came almost every other day in that stretch of late spring, dripping from the eaves, pooling in hoof prints, soaking through the thin cotton of the baby's sleeves before anyone noticed. But neither seemed to mind. They sat under the barn awning on most wet mornings. The bobcat stretched out beside the old stump. The child pressed close to Ella's side, fingers curled around a chipped enamel mug of warm milk. There was a rhythm to it all. The flick of the bobcat's ears, the rustle of pigeons in the rafters, the soft, rolling hum of the baby's breath when he drifted to sleep. Ella didn't speak. She never needed to. Whatever passed between her child and the wild creature was beyond her. So she let it be. And in return, the bobcat stayed. No cage held him. No fence enclosed him. The forest stood just beyond the pasture. Open, wild, free. But still, he remained. Each evening, as the sky dimmed and crickets claimed the fields, the bobcat would step out of the barn and face the tree line. He never went far. He would stare into the woods as if expecting something to emerge, something just beyond reach. Then, always at the same hour, He'd return to his place near the sleeping child, curl into himself, and disappear into stillness. That was the first quiet mystery. Why did he wait at the edge of the trees? Why the long stare into the dark? Ella wondered, but she never asked aloud, because asking would have broken the spell. Instead, she watched the boy grow, inch by inch, day by day, beneath the gaze of an animal no one else could have trusted. Not because the bobcat wasn't capable of harm, but because he had chosen not to be. There were signs of that choice everywhere. In the way he walked past open food without stealing a bite. In the way he stepped around the child's toys with surgical precision. In the way his eyes would soften. Not dull, but soften, when the boy looked back at him. Sometimes, the baby would lie on his stomach in the hay, pressing his face into his blanket, legs kicking the air. The bobcat would lie beside him, nose pointed forward, tail flicking every few seconds in perfect time. The boy would tap the floor once. The bobcat would blink. Nothing more. But it was always enough. They began to mirror each other in strange, subtle ways. The baby stopped crying when startled. Instead, he would freeze, head tilted, just like the bobcat. He began crawling in short, graceful bursts, low to the ground. Observant, he moved less like a toddler, and more like something from the forest. And yet, his eyes remained wide, soft, human. That balance, of wild and gentle, became the shape of their bond. People from town began to hear stories, not through gossip, but through photos, soft snapshots taken by Ella in the quiet light of morning. A baby nestled in straw, a bobcat in the background, both staring toward the same open door. At first, no one believed they were real. Then, no one knew what to say, because there was no explanation, only proof. The boy and the bobcat had become inseparable. When Ella took the child into the house for meals, the bobcat would sit beside the steps. He never entered, but he never left. If the child cried from the back window, the bobcat would rise, ears alert, and pace the porch once, then settle again. His body had become a part of their rhythm, not as an outsider, not as a rescued animal, but as something else, a constant. One late afternoon, the boy wandered too close to the pasture gate. The wind had pushed it open just a crack. Ella called his name, stepping into the yard, and then she saw it, the boy standing near the edge of the fence, just inches from the tall grass, and the bobcat, positioned between the child and the open field, body low, muscles taut, tail perfectly still. He didn't move toward the child. He didn't growl or hiss. He simply waited, his eyes locked on something deep in the brush. Ella couldn't see it. She didn't need to. Whatever it was, the bobcat had seen it first, and without a word, without a sound, he had placed himself there, as a line, as a wall, as something that would not let danger pass. She called the baby back. He turned. The bobcat stepped back with him, and then, just as before, he disappeared into stillness. No reward, no command, just the choice again. That night, as rain began to fall, Ella stood at the window. The bobcat was there, perched beneath the overhang, watching the dark trees, still waiting, still listening, as if something, some shadow from his past, still whispered from the forest. And she began to wonder, was he guarding them, or was he waiting for something to come back? The plane shifted, just slightly, no warning. A single bump beneath the wheels, as though the sky had exhaled too hard. Seatbelts tightened, cups rattled. Overhead, a few lights flickered in protest. Row 14 remained still. The baby had fallen asleep, his cheek pressed gently against the soft fold of a wool blanket, one hand tucked near his chest, the other resting on something most passengers still couldn't believe. The bobcat, He hadn't moved since the baby drifted off. Not even a twitch. His chest rose and fell in sync with the child's. The stillness between them. It wasn't silence. It was language. The kind of language that doesn't use sound. The kind that's felt in the spine, not heard in the air. The bobcat's eyes remained open. Not wide, just watchful. The kind of gaze that had studied tree lines for hours. That had once listened to a forest go quiet before a storm. Another jolt. This one sharper. Someone gasped near the front. A drink cart rolled an inch too far. Plastic cups scattered. The intercom crackled. A calm voice, practiced and steady. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing a brief patch of turbulence. But the voice faded beneath the tension now creeping across the cabin. All eyes turned again, toward the animal. The bobcat lifted his head. Not high, just enough to scan the aisle. Ears tipped slightly forward. Nostrils flared once. Then he turned toward the cockpit. A low pressure had dropped outside. The kind that animals sense long before humans feel it. A shift in air density. A warning carried on the wind, even up here. The baby stirred. Not from fear, just instinct. His hand moved across the blanket. Touched fur. Stayed there. The bobcat didn't react. But he adjusted his body slightly. Positioned himself so his weight met the baby's side. As though bracing them both. Another drop. Not violent. Just sudden. A brief shudder through the cabin. Luggage shifted above. An overhead bin popped open 2 rows ahead. A duffel bag tumbled out. Heavy fast. And hit the floor with a loud, unnatural thud. Gasps. One passenger shouted. Another ducked. The bobcat stood. Fluid slow, controlled. Not wild. Not startled. Just alert. He placed one paw gently across the baby's legs. Not pressing. Only making contact. The kind of gesture wolves make when circling a pup. The kind of presence that says, I'm still here. Flight attendants rushed to secure the loose bin. A passenger muttered something under his breath. Panic now beginning to bloom. But in row 14, the animal didn't bare teeth. Didn't growl. Didn't twitch with adrenaline. He simply stood over the child. His body curved protectively. His head low, ears turned outward. Guarding. The kind of guarding that isn't taught. The kind that's born from instinct and refined by something deeper. Memory. Back in the barn, this same bobcat had once done the same thing. Stood between a toddler and the unknown. Faced into the wind with quiet certainty. And now, here again, above the earth, he chose that same posture. The child exhaled softly. His fingers relaxed. The turbulence passed. But the weight in the cabin did not. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had felt it. Not just that the animal had responded, but how? Not with fear. Not with confusion. But with decision. The bobcat settled again. This time, his body pressed closer to the child's side. Not curled, not sprawled, but deliberate. A wall of breath and fur. The mother, seated across the aisle, had not moved once. Her hands remained folded. Her eyes never left them. She had known this moment would come. Not the flight, not the turbulence, but the moment the world would watch what she already knew. That trust isn't always earned with time. Sometimes it's chosen. The bobcat looked up. His gaze passed over the cabin, met the eyes of the man across from him. Then the woman behind. Then finally the window. Rain. Not much. Just streaking the glass with faint silver lines. Up here, it shouldn't have mattered, but it did. Because rain was part of their rhythm. It had always been there. In the barn, it had been the sound that lulled the child to sleep. It had been the scent that carried calm. It had been the signal that they were both safe. And now it returned, as if time hadn't moved, as if they'd never left. The bobcat lowered his head once more. He didn't sleep. He didn't retreat. He stayed. All around them, the cabin slowly resumed its pace. Plastic cups retrieved. Bin closed. Breaths exhaled. But something had changed. Not the animal. Not the child. The passengers. They had seen a truth they couldn't unsee. That the wild is not always what we fear. That sometimes it remembers us and chooses to stay anyway. The engine steadied. The captain's voice returned. But few listened. They were still watching row 14, still wondering how something so impossible could feel so natural, still holding on to the quiet realization that this moment, this image of fur and sleep and steady breathing, was not just unusual, it was sacred, and none of them would forget it, not because it was strange, but because it felt right, in a way they couldn't explain. They didn't notice at first. The bobcat had curled tighter than before. His body pressed closer to the child, his breathing heavier, slower. Still no growl, no sign of distress. But something shifted. His eyes remained half open, but unfocused. His chest rose, but didn't fall as quickly. The rise became effort. The stillness, a little too still. Only the mother noticed. Her fingers tensed slightly around the edge of her armrest. She leaned forward just an inch, eyes fixed not on the baby, but on the animal's side. And then she knew. This wasn't new. It was a return. The bobcat wasn't just guarding the child. He was saying goodbye. Long before this flight, before the tickets, before the decision to move east, the vet had said it plainly. His heart won't hold forever. It's strong, but uneven. He'll know before we do. They'd found the murmur during a routine scan 6 months earlier. A wild animal's heart, kept calm by sheer instinct, but weakening quietly. There were no symptoms, no behaviors out of place. Only a growing stillness in the mornings. More watching, less roaming, more presence, but from a place of effort. Still, he never left. The option to re-release him had always been on the table. He never took it, even as his body began betraying him in ways no one could see. He chose to stay close, to the barn, to the child, to the rhythm that made his days make sense. And now here, in the air, on a flight no one would forget, that choice was still holding. He did not collapse. He did not make a scene. He stayed, pressed against the child's legs, keeping him warm, keeping him asleep. But every breath cost more. The rain streaked thicker down the windows. Outside, clouds passed in soft, silent towers. The aircraft sailed steady, but something inside row 14 had begun to still. The baby stirred, shifting slightly in his seat. His fingers brushed the edge of the bobcat's ear. The animal didn't flinch, didn't move away, but his eyes opened slowly. And for a moment, he simply looked. At the child, at the blanket, at the space between them where the bond had always lived. And then, with a movement so soft it barely registered, he placed his head across the baby's lap. The passengers nearby held their breath. It looked like affection, but it was something else. Surrender, not to fear, not to pain, but to time. The kind of surrender wild creatures know how to make. Quiet, intentional, without needing to be explained, because their life is never measured in years, but in presence. Ella saw it happening, and she didn't interfere. She had promised him once, silently, in the barn, that if he ever chose when and where to go, she would let him. No cages, no cold rooms, no sterile table under bright lights. Just presence and peace. The bobcat's chest lifted again, then paused, then lifted once more. He was still there, but the shift had begun. Passengers weren't sure what they were seeing. They only knew the mood had changed. It wasn't fear. It wasn't grief, not yet. It was reverence. That indescribable stillness that settles when something sacred is near its close. The child remained asleep, safe and warm, unaware of the breath softening beside him. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that was what the bobcat had wanted. Not to be remembered for the barn, or the forest, or the day he stood between a baby and the wild, but for this moment, this final act, of choosing stillness beside the one who had never asked anything of him, except to stay. The engines continued their low hum. The captain's voice returned, a soft update. "We'll begin our descent shortly." But no one in row 14 moved. No one said a word, because words would have broken it. Ella stood slowly, crossed the aisle. She knelt beside her son, placing one gentle hand over the bobcat's back. He didn't move, but his breathing met her palm, still present, still faint, still holding on. She didn't speak, didn't cry. She simply bowed her head and whispered a memory to herself. A barn in spring, a rainstorm, a pair of golden eyes watching from the shadows. She closed her eyes and let the rest belong to him. The baby stirred. The bobcat shifted slightly, pressing closer. Then, the plane tilted gently downward. Final approach. Landing lights on. Routine for everyone else. But not here, because something was ending, and something else was being passed on. A moment, a memory, a bond. And when the tires finally touched the runway, there was no cheer, no applause, just a deep, collective quiet, as though the cabin itself understood. Some landings are louder, others are sacred, and some are goodbyes disguised as arrivals. The plane came to a full stop. No one unbuckled. A gentle chime signaled arrival, and the overhead bins creaked with early hands. But near row 14, no one moved, not yet. Not the mother, not the baby, not the animal curled around him like a quiet memory. The bobcat was still breathing, barely. A slow inhale, then long pause, then another, but his head remained resting across the child's lap, his body soft and warm, his eyes half closed. Not from sleep, but from surrender. The baby began to stir. He shifted his legs beneath the weight. Fingers reached forward, grazing the bobcat's ear. And for the last time, the animal responded. Not with sound, not with movement, but with the gentlest press of his brow against the child's hand. The child didn't cry. He didn't startle. He just watched and touched the fur again, as if to say, "I know." Ella stepped closer. Her hands hovered just above both bodies, uncertain who to lift first. But the moment decided for her. The bobcat exhaled, long and silent. His body softened, not collapsed, not gone, just complete. The passengers nearby noticed. They didn't gasp, didn't speak. A woman in 13B brought her hand to her lips. A man behind them lowered his camera. What they had witnessed wasn't grief. It was grace. Because the wild cat didn't vanish. He remained. His warmth lingered in the space where connection had lived. And the child still held his paw. Ella lowered herself slowly and lifted her son. The bobcat didn't resist. He lay exactly as he had chosen, still, curved gently around the soft outline of a memory. She stood, holding the child to her chest, and for a long moment, she simply looked down at the animal who had stayed longer than anyone had asked, and given more than anyone had expected. No words passed her lips. None were needed, because the bond wasn't built in words. It never had been. A stewardess approached, her voice soft and unsure. Ella nodded once. No explanation. Just a gesture toward the seat. They didn't call security. Didn't page medical. They let it be what it was, the ending of a story that had begun long before any of them had known it was happening. A special escort was arranged. No one rushed them. A velvet-lined crate was brought up quietly, respectful and warm. Not a cage, not a container, just a place for him to rest, now that his watching was done. Ella stepped out first, down the narrow aisle, her child in her arms, head resting on her shoulder, eyes wide, still quiet. The terminal lights were bright, too bright, but beyond the glass, past the lines, past the chatter, the sky was changing, clouds pulling apart, rain easing into mist, and between them, a slow gold stretched across the horizon. A sunrise, or maybe an ending dressed like one. The staff wheeled the crate behind her. Passengers stepped aside. Some touched their chests. Others lowered their eyes. But none of them forgot what they had seen. A wild animal lying silent, not in fear, but in peace, beside a child who had never known to be afraid. Outside, a breeze curled past the windows. It carried the scent of rain and earth and something softer, like hay, like pine, like memory. A local sanctuary was waiting, a quiet, wooded place with tall grass and old oaks, not far from where he'd first been found. He would be buried there. No plaque, no ceremony, just a stone, a smooth one, set beneath a tree, where rain could fall and roots could reach. Ella would visit, not always, but often enough. And the child, he would grow. He would not remember every detail, but he would remember warmth, and breath, and eyes that never looked away. Weeks later, a photo surfaced online, taken by a quiet woman in row 13. Not staged, not filtered, just real. It showed a baby sleeping, fingers curled gently in fur. A bobcat, still alert, peaceful, watching out the window as rain traced the glass. The caption said nothing. It didn't need to. The image was enough. It was shared, then shared again, then again. Not because it was strange, but because it was honest. Because somewhere deep in the human soul, we still understand what it means when two beings trust without needing words. When a wild heart chooses to stay, to guard, to love, and then to let go. The last image of the story wasn't taken with a camera. It was taken by those who watched them walk across the tarmac that morning. A mother, a child, and a crate holding something more than fur and muscle. Something sacred. As they disappeared into the morning mist, a beam of sun struck the runway behind them. Long and gold and quiet. The kind of light that doesn't shout. That doesn't explain. It just falls where it's meant to fall. And stays long enough to be remembered.